Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Idea of American Exceptionalism from the Puritans to President Obama, an online professional development seminar sponsored by America in Class from the National Humanities Center. I'm Richard Schramm, the Vice President for Education Programs at the Humanities Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. Before we get underway, I'd like to take a few minutes to introduce you to the National Humanities Center. We are located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. We are the country's only independent institute for advanced study in all branches of the humanities. What does that mean exactly? Well, it means, first of all, we're independent. We're a private nonprofit organization. We are an institute for advanced study, which means the main program we offer here is a fellowship program that brings scholars from this country and abroad to the center for an academic year to research and write books and articles on topics in the humanities, disciplines like history, literature and language studies, philosophy, criticism of the arts, that sort of thing. We opened in 1978. About 1,300 scholars have worked here since then, and they've produced about 1,300 books. Now, that may make the place sound like an ivory tower, and from this picture you see it looks like an ivory tower, but it's really not. The founders wanted it to connect with a wide array of audiences, and they were particularly interested in connecting with teachers. And we do that in a number of ways. In our online seminars, our primary sources through teaching anthologies, secondary sources through our website TeacherServe, and our new lessons, America in Class lessons. Now, if you want to find out about all the things we offer for teachers, go to americainclass.org. You will find there access to everything we offer. You will find America in Class lessons, that new item I mentioned. These are lessons based on primary documents. They follow the core state standards. They're all built around framing questions and essential understandings. You'll find there online access to a text, background material, advice on teaching the text, key excerpts that you can use with your students for class discussion, some class discussion questions, and in some cases some follow-up assignments that you can use for assessment. All that is available to you in americainclass.org. Now, the lessons, we have 8 lessons up there right now. They range from early visual representations of the New World down through the cult of domesticity. Please check back to americainclass.org lessons, and you'll find more lessons as the academic year proceeds. Now, when you go to America in Class, you will find there this little icon that I framed in red. It's an icon, a picture of an octopus. Click on that, and it'll take you to this page. And from this page, you can order that image of the octopus. We'll send you a free poster. It's really a handsome poster. On one side, it has that image of the octopus, which is completely annotated and makes a wonderful teaching tool. And on the other side, you'll have all sorts of information about what America in Class offers teachers. Now, this evening, when the seminar is over, you'll find a recording of the seminar and the PowerPoint on the Idea of American Exceptionalism website. That's the same website you use to access the readings for this seminar. We urge you to plunder the PowerPoint. It is there for your use. Please take it back into your classes. On this website, you will also find the evaluation for the seminar. Please fill that out and submit it to us online. It's important we pay attention to what you say. Once we have that evaluation, we'll send you a letter that you can present to your local certifying authority to get whatever recertification credit your participation in this seminar warrants. Now, how the seminar works. Well, we're going to, our Professor Del Banco is going to give a lecture tonight, keyed to some presentation of some slides with excerpts that illustrate important points. Some of the excerpts we'll analyze through discussion, others we'll move on to. How do you participate? Well, you can participate in 2 ways. See that little red box, and there's a hand? Well, you can click on that hand-raising icon, and I will see it. And when I do see it, I will pass the microphone to you, and you can hold forth. However, most people participate by chat. You can put your cursor in the chat box, which is framed in green at the bottom of the screen. Type your message, hit the send button, and your message will appear in the chat box above the send frame. Are there any questions now before we get underway? If we're ready to go, send me a smiley face so I'll know that everybody's paying attention and they're on board, and we're all ready to move ahead and learn about American exceptionalism. There we go. Come on, need a few more. Okay. All right, great. So let's move ahead then. Now, our goals for this evening are simple. We want to provide you with some fresh primary resources and instructional approaches for use with students. And we're also aiming at a particular understanding this evening. So what would be the big idea you take away from this seminar? Well, I think that big idea would be this one, that since the earliest days of our national existence, Americans have believed that this country possesses a peculiar centrality in the world. that the meaning of that centrality has always been contested. We had a pretty good discussion of this on the forum. We had a number of questions. How did the idea of American exceptionalism originate? How did it become part of our identity and culture? How has it been contested? How has the idea of American exceptionalism changed from generation to generation? And one participant offered us some resources. She noted that the current issue of foreign policy has an article, Just How Special is America Anyway? And the URL for that is here on the screen, but it's also available on the forum. She also suggested that you might want to look at two other texts. On the Puritan idea of exceptionalism, there is Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel, The Scarlet Letter, and then one that I'm unfamiliar with, a very good writer, a very funny writer, Sarah Vowell, in her book, The Wordy Shipmates. The participant mentioned that Vowell helps to make those fusty old Puritans fascinating and relevant, so you may want to take a look at that. And then finally, she offered a graphic novel, American-Born Chinese, on Americanization, immigration, inclusion, and exclusion. We appreciate those resources. Now, to lead us through our discussion of American exceptionalism this evening, we're very pleased to have with us Andrew Delbanco, who is a fellow and a trustee of the National Humanities Center. When he's not here being a fellow and a trustee, he is the Julian Clarence Levy Professor of the Humanities and the Director of American Studies at Columbia University. We could not hope to fit all of Andy's publications on one slide, so you see them there. And I want to point out that early next year, he has a new book coming out called College, What It Was, Is, and Should Be. So, Andy, let me turn the program over to you now so that you can tell us what American exceptionalism is, was, and will be. Andy, it's all yours.
Thank you, Richard. Can everyone hear me? I assume so. I hope so.
I think so. If everyone can hear, send us. All right, there we go. We've got some smiley faces. I think people can hear you, Andy.
Okay.
Take it away.
Well, I want to say a couple preliminary things. First, I always enjoy these. I enjoy the ones I've done in person at the National Humanities Center, and this is my slow introduction into the world of high-tech education, so I enjoy the ones that are online as well, and I hope you'll all get something out of it. Number one, Richard, I really want a poster of that octopus because I thought that was terrific.
You'll get one. We'll have the man for you tomorrow.
Thank you. So number two, I wanted to just ask you, since there were 1,300 fellows and they produced 1,300 books, there wasn't a rule that you could only write one book, right? I mean, some people wrote 10, other people didn't write any. Is that fair?
That's right. That's right. I think you are one of the you're one of the folks who exceeded the average, though.
I just wanted to get that clear. And then,
okay.
And then the third thing, but really the most important and first serious thing I want to say is that Richard said I was going to give a lecture, and I suppose I will make some claims and offer some statements and observations, and alas, in the nature of things, we'll probably do most of the talking, but I really don't want this to be a formal lecture. I would much prefer it to be some give and take discussion, conversation, because I don't want to give the impression that I have good answers necessarily to the questions I want to raise. Now, some of the questions that arose in the forum are really very much to the point, and I assume that everybody who has signed up for this seminar is curious, possibly troubled in some way by the proposition either that America once was a special and exceptional nation and maybe losing its confidence in itself in some way today, and I think that's something worth talking about. Others may be troubled by what is sometimes regarded as a history of a certain kind of American arrogance and presumptuousness that we, and words like we and Americans are words that I think we want to put some pressure on tonight because, of course, America is a vast and diverse country, and we don't want to give one another the impression that there's some unanimity of opinion on these matters. But that, with that said, that we Americans have had a history of trying to tell the rest of the world how to behave, how to organize its other societies in our own image. And there's a considerable literature out there to suggest that there is a strain of that in American culture. If you think of the novels of Henry James, for instance, which I'm sure some of you have read some of, one of his persistent themes, he was, of course, an American-born writer who then went into self-imposed exile and lived most of his life in England. And one of his themes was the American in Europe, or the New World visitor to the Old World. And he was particularly fascinated by the Americans' combination of naivete and innocence, and inability to sort of read the signs and figure out the complex forms of social behavior that were expected in the old world. Think of a novel like The Portrait of a Lady, where this young girl from Albany, New York, gets into all kinds of trouble because she misunderstands people and miscalculates and takes good people for bad and bad people for good, and so on and so forth. And then there is a more modern literature. I think of a book that had a big presence in when I was young, called The Ugly American. It became a movie, I think, with Marlon Brando, about an American diplomat in Southeast Asia, which, if you see it today, had certain prophetic qualities with regard to our involvement in Vietnam. And even earlier than that, a book that I strongly recommend any of you who haven't read it, take a look at sometime, from, I think it was published in 1954 by the great English author Graham Greene, The Quiet American, which, again, was a study of the American idea that somehow what the Europeans had not been able to achieve in Southeast Asia, that was written, of course, in the year that the French were driven out of Indochina at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam, that the American had the arrogance and presumptuousness to believe that we would know what to do to solve the problems of Southeast Asia. We would come in and we would find a middle way between the old colonialism of the Europeans and the threat of communist domination. So I'm just gesturing to a few works, and we're going to go way back to a much earlier period in a moment, that suggest that at least some serious writers, some people who've thought seriously about this question, have believed that Americans have a tendency to sort of blunder into situations in the world because they think they know more than they really do. So I assume that what we're interested in tonight, and I just think I've clicked on the screen and moved us to the first text slide from William Bradford's Plymouth Plantation, written probably in the 1640s and not published actually until the 19th century. But a work, of course, which is a historical account of the first New England settlement that we've come to think of as that of the Pilgrims, Plymouth Rock and all that, the first Thanksgiving, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a reasonable place to start, I think, if we want to explore the roots of this idea of American exceptionalism. And as you can see on the slide, I asked Richard to highlight in red one sentence. If you're speed readers, you can read through the whole passage. What he's doing in this passage is he's pausing in his narrative of historical events to reflect, to sort of meditate on the situation that these early English settlers found themselves in. And he immediately goes to Scripture, to the Bible, as the reference point for the experience that he is recalling. As you can see up a little bit above the highlighted area, it is recorded in Scripture as a mercy to the apostle and his shipwrecked company that the barbarians showed them no small kindness. But these savage barbarians, that is, those whom we would now call Native Americans, when they met with them, as after will appear, that is, as I will later recount in my history, they were readier to fill their sides, our sides, that is, full of arrows than otherwise. That is, this was a dangerous place. This was an inhospitable place. And for the season, it was winter. And they that know the winters of that country, and I imagine some of you who've logged in tonight have spent some winter times on Cape Cod, perhaps, and you know what he's talking about. Those that know the winters of that country know them to be sharp and violent and subject to cruel and fierce storms, dangerous to travel, much more to search an unknown coast. Besides, what could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness, full of wild beasts and wild men? And what multitudes there might be of them they knew not. Now, I think we could pause on this, but probably shouldn't, since we want to make some headway tonight, but just briefly to say that I get the feeling when I read this, I don't know how the rest of you feel, that there's a little bit of too much protesting here. There's a little bit of, let me tell you how hard it was for us. It sort of has that element that I think a great deal of American writing has always had, particularly writing by immigrants or second generation immigrants who say to the children, to the grandchildren, you don't know how hard we had it, right? You've got it easy, but we really had it hard. And I think actually what we're looking at here could be construed as one of the first examples of the literature of American immigration. And in fact, Bradford really was writing for posterity, for his children and grandchildren to make sure they realized what he and his generation had gone through in order to achieve freedom for them. And that takes us, if I could put it that way, to one of the first claims that people make when they talk about America's exceptionalness, namely that we are an immigrant nation. There's a famous comment by the great and now recently late historian Oscar Handlin, who died just a couple of weeks ago, who wrote a famous book in the 1950s called The Uprooted, in which he says at the beginning of that book, he wanted to study immigration in American history when he was in graduate school. And then one day he sort of woke up and realized that immigration was American history. And indeed, he opened up the whole subject of immigration in a way that it hadn't been opened up before. So that's one way in which we've been thought of as an exceptional nation. Another way that many historians have pointed out, and this I think we could trace back to Alexis de Tocqueville's great book on democracy in America, which we could have looked at something from that book tonight, but we're not. In which Tocqueville makes the observation as a Frenchman coming over in the 1830s to this new democratic country that was just getting off the ground. He makes the observation that, you know what, this is a country that never went through feudalism, right? All the European nations, certainly including his own, had a very long period when the church, either the Roman Catholic Church or in the case of Britain, the Anglican Church, which broke away from Roman Catholicism, but where the church and the state were integrally connected. And for a long period of time, there was really no distinction between them. And then in the period of what we think of as early modern history, tensions began to arise between the forces of secularism, the forces of what we might call early capitalism, and the state began to slowly disengage itself from the church, in some instances very violently, through bloody revolution, as was, of course, the case in France at the end of the 18th century and in a number of other countries. So Tocqueville makes the observation, the exceptional thing about America, the thing that makes America different, is that they never had that phase. They never really had, yes, they had a revolution against sort of a foreign occupying power, but they never had an internal struggle, a class war, really, between the old feudal aristocracy and the emerging middle class. So that's another case that has been made for the exceptionalism of America. I'm not saying that either one of these cases, the immigrant case or the no feudalism case, is entirely persuasive, but they're both quite interesting and I think arguments that we should be aware of as we explore this subject. And then there's another case, which I'm just very brief about, we could talk about later perhaps, and that is just the sheer natural resources, the vastness of the American continent. When the United States declared itself a nation, of course, it was still a group of colonies and then states hugging the Atlantic shore. But already, there was a gleam in the eye of people like Thomas Jefferson, who a few years later bought all that vast territory in the Louisiana Purchase and sent Lewis and Clark out west. There was a stated or unstated expectation that America was going to become a continental nation. Its destiny, its manifest destiny, to use a phrase with which you're all familiar, was really to conquer this whole continent. And there were many figures at that period who actually imagined conquering more of the continent than we actually did, including British Canada and Spanish Mexico and Spanish Cuba. So there were big plans. And one of the objections that the founding fathers found themselves contending with when they went about the business of constructing a republic on the basis of a constitution came from European intellectuals who said, you've got to be kidding. You can't possibly have a republic over such a vast expanse of territory with people who are so different from one another. There's no way it's going to work. If you look at European history, you had small nation states in Italy, like Venice was its own nation state for a while, or Florence, or the principalities of Germany, or the cantons of Switzerland. But these are very, very small areas with people who mostly thought of themselves as closely related to one another and been living in the same place for generations, speaking the same language. So there's no way you're going to be able to put together a coherent nation over this vast expanse. Now, if you look at American exceptionalism in that context, then one thing you could say is we're exceptional because those critics have turned out to be wrong. I mean, there was one 4-year-long moment in the middle of the 19th century when it looked like they might be right, and when America looked like it was going to split into two nations. But once that was resolved, whatever our problems are, and there are plenty of them, I don't think anybody takes very seriously the idea that the United States might actually splinter and disintegrate into multiple states the way the Soviet Union did, the way other empires have done. Now, who knows? Could be wrong about that, but that's not something that a lot of people expect. So,
if I can just interrupt you for a moment, we've got to move on, but we've got some really good questions here. In your in the schema you're outlining here, the bases of exceptionalism. You put it, immigration, we did not have feudalism, there's this sense of conquest, manifest destiny, and stretching our republican government across the vast expanse.
Right.
What you've not mentioned is the particular way Americans seem to invoke God. And one of our participants have noted in the red highlighted area, I think the highlighted section speaks to Americans looking to God for hope, guidance in most every area of life. At least the Puritans did this for some period. So could you, I know we're going to move ahead on that, so perhaps we should. How does Americans, the way we seem to particularly invoke God, how does that figure into all this?
Well, it's an excellent point, excellent question, and I was slowly in my meandering way making my way there, but I'm happy to get there immediately. Perhaps before we look at the passage in just a moment, if you speak to people in Europe about the contemporary United States, one of the things that amazes them the most is how much of what sometimes is called God talk there is still in our politics. It's totally amazing to Europeans, and most of whom, at least most of whom I know, that we still have so much religion in our public life, and so much debate about religious issues, and so much religious discourse in our public life. And that is very definitely another element of what appears to make us exceptional. Now, we finally arrive at the red highlighted passage in slide 1, and there you see, as Richard suggested, as one of you apparently suggested in a chat message, one of the originating points of this preoccupation, where Bradford says of his fellow immigrants, neither could they, as it were, go up to the top of Pisgah. Mount Pisgah, of course, the mount from which Moses viewed the promised land. To view from this wilderness a more goodly country to feed their hopes. For which way soever they turned their eyes, save upward to the heavens, they could have little solace or content in respect of any outward objects. It just occurs to me as I read that aloud, you know, many of us remember, or if we're too young, we've seen the film or read the extraordinarily moving speech by Martin Luther King that he delivered on the night before his assassination, almost 350 years after Bradford's passage here, in which he says, and I'm paraphrasing, I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you. And there was that eerie sense that he anticipated his own early death. I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get there. And as a people, incidentally, I think he didn't mean just African Americans or black people, but I think he meant all Americans. But I make that point to suggest there's a vast bridge that's connecting Bradford from the 17th century with Martin Luther King and many others, some of which we'll get to later in our discussion, in the 20th and even the 21st century. So here we have in that read passage this preoccupation with religion, and specifically this identification with the ancient Israelites, that what they were doing, what these Puritan immigrants were doing, was really reenacting the pilgrimage of a chosen people coming out of a certain kind of captivity into the promised land. And that theme is very resonant through much of our history. Now, I think I've skipped over a couple of slides here. Yeah. Has everybody got a model of Christian charity on the screen now?
Yes, yes, we do.
Okay. So this is a text which dates from just a little bit later. I mean, it was actually probably written before Bradford, but it describes a situation 10 years after Bradford, because Bradford and the Pilgrims came over in 1620. This is from John Winthrop, the leader of what's sometimes called the Great Migration. That is a much larger, many thousands of Puritan immigrants who came over not to the Cape, but who came to Massachusetts Bay and founded what became the city of Boston, the city of Cambridge, and began the sort of Puritan diaspora that eventually settled all of New England and stretched to Long Island and to Brooklyn, and then in the later 18th and early 19th century started moving westward into the Western Reserve. So here we have really the first big Puritan migration, and the famous words that Winthrop uttered, it was sometimes thought that he actually gave this sermon aboard ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But I think the latest scholarly opinion is that he probably delivered the sermon before they embarked on their journey. But he makes this famous statement: "We must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. So that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a byword through the world." Now, I don't know, Richard, is the technology good enough so I can ask a question and somebody can actually speak?
Oh, well, sure.
Okay.
Put one out there. But before we do, let me just say we've got a number of really good questions here. People are getting at the notion of whether or not American exceptionalism predates our immigration and feudalism and all that. if the Pilgrims, if the Puritans thought of themselves as Israelites, as the chosen,
Right.
did they not bring that sense of exceptionalism with them to this
Well,
country? And did it, or did exceptionalism form, as one participant says, in hindsight? Is this an interpretation we laid on our experience,
right.
or was
Well,
it, did
it's
it come over on the boat?
it's a great question, and I don't think it's an either-or question. I think what I'm trying to suggest by my little list, immigration, vastness, no feudalism, and now, as you properly guide us toward, the idea of a peculiar chosenness, godliness, that we are a new chosen people. All of these elements, it seems to me, have worked together in our history. And I mean, the very idea of manifest destiny really suggests, right, that it's a providential plan. It's God's will that this particular people should spread across this continent, set up certain kinds of institutions in accordance with God's wishes, and uh, and represent to the rest of humanity in the way the Israelites uh, thought thought of themselves as showing the way toward certain ethical precepts contained in the Ten Commandments, to show the way to the rest of humanity of what is the proper way to live. And you're quite right. I think that idea was in the minds of these original settlers, who of course couldn't read the future and had no idea about continental expansion and all the rest, but who already had this notion that they were embarked on a mission that had a peculiar blessing from a God who was especially interested in what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, but the question I wanted to ask, I mean, I'm, for good or ill, I make my living more or less as an English professor, so I'm in the business of looking closely at the words. It is often said that this arrogance that I was talking about earlier, this presumptuousness, is there from the beginning in the kinds of texts that we've been looking at in Bradford and now in Winthrop. That they're very full of themselves and very sure that they're going to make a go of it and very convinced that God is on their side and so on. But I would ask you or anyone looking at this text, is that the impression that you get from this particular statement?
Okay. Question
Anybody want to react to that? When he says the eyes of all people are upon us, that's true. He's saying everybody's looking at me, at us. We're the center of the picture. But what does he go on to say after that? What is the concern that he's expressing here in this passage?
Okay. Anybody want to tackle that question? Is this passage evince an arrogance that has stayed with us, or is this some humility there? I get the impression of great stress that they believe much is at stake whether they fail or succeed. These ideas of the Puritans have not left the minds of people today. They're still arrogant. They're still arrogance that should change the world to be more like us. We have to earn the right to be exceptional. Start of self-made concept. And here Lou Barada mentions keep God and our actions centered to our lives and the way we set up our government. So, and then we are right and and God will prove that we are right by his favor. And here another participant talks about the idea of a covenant. So I don't hear anybody saying that this is purely arrogant. It seems to be undercut with some stress, fear, trepidation, touch of humility.
Exactly. That's the point I wanted to try to bring out, that it seems to me that this is a passage that actually contains a good deal of anxiety about whether God will continue to show his favor, right? The eyes of the world are going to be on us because they're looking to see if God will stick with us, right? And we will be made a story and a byword through the world, not because we're going to be the new conquistadors, but if we fail in this enterprise. And I think that's a difference. It may be a subtle difference, and some of you may disagree with the emphasis I'm putting on it, but I think it's a difference. And I would say, you can hear me, right, Richard?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I would say that, we don't have more text from this particular text. I would urge all of you who are online with us to go and look at the full text sometime and ask yourselves, what exactly did Winthrop mean by success, and what did he mean by failure? What would it mean for them to fail that would lead to God's disapproval? And I would suggest to you, by paraphrasing the text that we don't have on the screen, what he goes on to talk about is we have to be, using scriptural imagery, we have to be knit together in this work as one man. We have to support each other. We have to take care of each other, and we have to love each other. And in fact, on the morning of 9/11, 2001, as it happens, I had a class at about 10 o'clock that morning, about an hour after the planes hit the Trade Center. And I didn't know what to do, but I went to class, and the students came to class because I think they needed a sense of their lives going on. And what we did is we read this text aloud in that class, and we particularly lingered on the passages in which Winthrop called for people to pull together, to hold together, to hang together. And he goes on and says, rich people have to show charity and generosity toward poor people. It's not all about how the poor and lowly have to show obedience to the rich and mighty. It goes in both directions. So I'm bringing out that point, and we can move on in a second, just to suggest that I think at the very beginning of American civilization, or Anglo-American civilization anyway, exemplified by this text, there is an idea of community, an idea that the thing that makes America exceptional is that we are going to be a real community, and we're going to take care of our own. We're going to take care of each other. That is, I think something we're still debating. I don't mean to jump ahead to the end of the discussion, but obviously we're still debating in this society, what do we owe to each other, right? I mean, what exactly do the rich owe to the poor? There are some people who are demonstrating in cities throughout America right now, and they're objecting to the idea that there's 1% of the population that owns an enormous amount of the wealth, and they have the feeling that they're not giving back enough. I'm not taking a position on that question right now or asking any of you what your politics are, but I'm just pointing out that the discussion about what do Americans owe to each other is as alive today as it was in Winthrop's moment. So let's move forward. I've clicked on this thing, and now we've jumped forward more than 200 years to a passage by my favorite writer, Herman Melville. This is a book that he wrote just before his most famous book, Moby Dick, which we won't get to tonight. And again, it's a little bit of a long passage, so if you can scan it perhaps while I'm talking. But the main point I want to make here is that the imagery that we have seen in these early Puritan texts and the identification with the Israelites, here it is, 220 years later, in absolutely even more vigorously or even belligerently expressed, right? We Americans are the peculiar chosen people, the Israel of our time. He's actually saying that more. He's more out there with that than the Puritans themselves were. We bear the ark of the liberties of the world. 70 years ago, and remember he's writing in 1850, so he's referring to the revolution itself. 70 years ago, we escaped from thrall. And besides our first birthright, embracing one continent of Earth, there's that manifest destiny idea, which the Native Americans who had been here for a long time, I think, probably took a different view of. I mean, who says that this continent belongs to you by your birth? We've been here longer than you have. So one of the questions that was raised in Richard's introduction was, has the idea of American exceptionalism been contested? Well, it certainly has been contested. Some of the people who contested it have been swept aside and told, you may not agree, but we've got the power and you don't, so that's the way it's going to be. Anyway, embracing one continent of Earth, God has given to us for a future inheritance the broad domains of the political pagans that shall yet come and lie down under the shade of our ark without bloody hands being lifted. Now, I often pause at that point when I'm looking at this text with my own students and remind them, do you remember what Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld said in the very early days of the Iraq War, which is now, about 10 years ago, right? That we were going to be greeted as liberators with chocolates and flowers, that there weren't going to be any bloody hands lifted against us. So I mention that, again, not to get into a political discussion pro or con the Iraq War, but to point out that this idea that Melville is expressing here in the middle of the 19th century has remained alive in the culture for a very long time, and even the language with which he expresses it. Then just skipping down toward the bottom, we've been skeptics too long, he says, with regard to ourselves. He's talking about the sort of inferiority complex that Americans had in the early 19th century when they looked at the sophisticated Europeans and felt that we didn't measure up. He said, Melville says, drop that. The political Messiah, using that religious term, has come. He has come in us. All we have to do is express ourselves. And let us always remember that with ourselves, almost for the first time in the history of Earth, national selfishness is unbounded philanthropy. That is, if we do what's good for us, we're actually doing what's good for all of mankind. For we cannot do a good to America, but we give alms to the world. So in some ways, I'm sure some of you are thinking, and I just see a message from Rachel saying sounds crazy. I don't know if that's referring.
That's referring to some other.
Okay, all right. But some people would say that this passage sounds crazy. Who the hell are we to think that the rest of the world should lie down in front of us and beg us to show them the way, and anything good for America is good for the world? And of course, there are a lot of people in the world. I don't think this is going to come as a big surprise to any of you. Some of our most deadly enemies hate us precisely because they think we have this arrogant attitude of steamrolling over their cultural traditions and imposing our way of life on them. Now, you may be surprised, Richard may be surprised to hear me talking this way about this passage by Herman Melville, since I started out by saying Herman Melville is my favorite writer, and I wrote a whole book about him and think he was a total genius. And so I would just very quickly say, and this is, again, something I say to my students and something I hope you would share with your students, whenever we read anything, we want to place it back in its own historical context. So if you read this passage in the context of our moment, the Iraq War, or my moment when I was in college, the Vietnam War, it sounds unbelievably arrogant, and you say, aha, you want to know why we're in Vietnam? And Norman Mailer wrote a novel called Why Are We in Vietnam? Just read this kind of thing, and you'll see why we're in Vietnam. We'll get to that a little later. But if you place it back in its passage in the time when Melville wrote it, in 1850, you want to recall that the revolutions of 1848 were being turned back all over Europe, so that the democratic aspirations of the peoples of Italy and the people of France, and even in some measure the people of Britain, those democratic aspirations for what later on we would call self-determination and freedom from tyranny were being turned back by a reassertion of power by the old autocratic governments in Europe. So Melville is saying Melville is really saying here is we are showing the way forward for democracy. We are a nation that is enacting a new idea, which is that all human beings are of equal value, that you don't have to live the same life that your parents lived necessarily, that your fate is not determined by the circumstances of your birth. These are the exceptional ideas that Melville has in mind when he talks about America as the new Israel. So, I think that's a context that's worth keeping in mind.
Yeah, and that raises a good point. Earlier, one of the participants noted that sort of one way to interpret this American arrogance is also as the very confidence that allowed this nation to succeed as it has. So I think that addresses what you're saying. And then we've had this theme coming up over and over again in the chat. Do other countries think of themselves in a similar way, that they're the chosen, they are the ones with the burden to spread civilization? I mean, the British have not exactly been shy and meek people. They did once have, the sun never set on their empire. So how does American exceptionalism, is that common to any other nation?
I think it's a very good question, and I'm not really very well equipped to answer it, because the only country I know anything about is America in any serious way. But I think, we all know something about other cultures and have some sense of context, and I think it's a very good point, and it may well be that our preoccupation with American exceptionalism, our topic tonight, really is a function of the fact that we have lived through what Henry Luce famously called the American century, the 20th century. And even though you can't pick up the newspaper without reading about the decline of America and the rise of China and all the rest, the fact remains we are still the world's only truly significant superpower. We're likely to remain that way for some time to come. And so the world sees us as the big guy on the block, the culture that has pervaded and permeated all the cultures of the world through our mass entertainment and all the rest. And so it may well be, the Germans had their moment, of course, of thinking of themselves as the conquering Aryan race in the middle of the 20th century, which, thank goodness, they found out was not going to be the case. The Chinese have always had a sense of their being the center of the world and everybody outside their borders being barbarians. Napoleon saw himself as spreading the principles of French civilization around the world. So, of course, we don't have a monopoly on this sense of exceptionalism, but our sense of exceptionalism has particular qualities and particular characteristics that I think is what we're talking about tonight. And it's also been the most successful form of exceptionalism in the modern world. And in a sense, you mentioned the British, Richard, quite properly. I mean, whether we like it or not, there's a continuum between Britain and the United States. I mean, those guys I started talking about, William Bradford and John Winthrop, they didn't think of themselves as Americans.
Right.
In fact, if they used the word American, they would have been referring to what they called Creoles or Indians, what we call Native Americans. They thought of themselves as Englishmen. Thomas Jefferson thought of himself as an Englishman who was asserting his right to the rights of Englishmen that had been abrogated and usurped by an unjust king and an unjust parliament. So there's a very blurry line between England and America for a very long time. And we may not feel it so vividly today, but, we felt it during the period of the Second World War, the special relationship. Winston Churchill used to speak about our American cousins, and I think we want to keep that Anglo-American continuity in mind.
Okay, we have a question here that does bear upon one of the forum questions. What was the difference between 19th century American confidence and post-1945 American confidence? Would you say that in the 19th century that confidence manifests itself in spreading the nation from coast to coast, and then in after World War II in the 20th century, it became global. Would that be a fair difference to point out?
Well, I think that's fair. I mean, like any interesting person or any interesting society, America is full of contradictions. So I've been talking all about manifest destiny and showing the way to the rest of the world and the rise of American power and everything. But there's also always been a parallel or contrapuntal counter theme to that, and that, of course, has been American isolationism, right?
Mm-hmm.
The famous speech by President Washington. We don't want to have any entangling alliances, right? And that isolationist theme runs through our history. Woodrow Wilson was not able, after the First World War, he was not able to get the Congress of the United States to approve American participation in the League of Nations. Pretty remarkable fact if you think about it. And there was strong isolationist sentiment again that Franklin Roosevelt had to overcome when he saw that the world was really going to go down the tubes in a big way if the United States did not intervene, and it became easier for him after the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor. So the American exceptionalism of the 19th century and even the early 20th century, I think, has an isolationist tinge to it, and there's, I mean, after all, Bradford and Winthrop, these people we started talking about, what are they doing? They're running away. They're getting out of the old world. They're looking for a place where they can be on their own and left alone. And that's also a very powerful theme in our cultural history, isn't it? I mean, the dropout theme, the heading, or as Huck Finn says in Mark Twain's great novel, lighting out for the territories, getting out of the mess. I mean, one of the later slides we have, if we can get to it, is from The Great Gatsby, Scott Fitzgerald's great novel, told in the first person by Nick Carraway, right? Who at the end of the novel wants to get the hell out of the corrupt world of the East Coast, rich people, and go back to the pure, clean Middle West. So that theme of getting away, getting out, getting on your own is a very powerful one in our country, and I don't think I need to belabor the point that we have groups that have withdrawn from our society, whether it's the Mormons from the 19th century Mormons who went all the way out to Utah in order to try to start a sort of a society of their own where they would be left alone, or modern day groups that have withdrawn, people who try to live on communes. You could even, if you want to get a little crazy about it, you could draw a line from, let's say, Henry David Thoreau going to his shack on Walden Pond to the Unabomber living in his cabin in, where was it, Montana or Minnesota? I can't remember.
Right. Well, we really need to move on, Andy. We've got about 40 minutes left.
Okay, so we can go zipping right through these 4 slides. I thought it would be fun to look at something visual rather than just verbal. This is a series of paintings by the early 19th century painter Thomas Cole. You can see they show, and this is in a way an objection, a counter theme to the theme of exceptionalism. They show the course of an empire. And what he means by that is this is the way every empire goes. This was true for the Greeks, the Persians, the Romans, and in a sense these were grim pictures because he was showing the inevitability that this was going to happen to us too. And in that sense, it was an argument to say we're not exceptional. So here we start with, pure nature. I don't know how well you can see the image on your screen. There's no human artifact here. Then we go to the pastoral states, where we begin to get a society based on in agriculture, tranquil, contemplative relationship to nature. There's no conflict here. Man living in harmony with nature. Then we go to the moment when the empire has reached its apogee, and we see that something that looks vaguely like the Roman Forum, perhaps, where we have sophisticated architecture and civilized discourse and gatherings for the purposes of commerce and politics, and so on. And then, what's the last side? Destruction, decadence. Everything breaks down, and people start to get at each other's throats, and the whole thing reverts finally in desolation. You're back to the beginning point, and maybe the cycle will begin all again. So this is rather than a progressive view of history, this is a cyclical view of history, and this idea too is very prevalent in our culture. I mean, it's sort of all the disaster movies, right? Escape from New York back from the 70s, when there was one movie after another about how all the great cities of America were going to rack and ruin, and weeds were growing through Fifth Avenue, and marauders were wandering in the streets, etc. Well, Thomas Cole sort of had that vision in the 19th century too. So there was a dialogue going on. It's almost a kind of a response to what Melville is saying in the form of this series of paintings. Moving along, and I'll try to pick up the pace here. A great text. When I was a kid, we had to memorize it. I don't know if that's the case anymore in our schools. Abraham Lincoln's extraordinary address at the commemoration of the battlefield at Gettysburg. And just very quickly, look how it starts, the famous words, 77 years ago. Immediately takes us back to that biblical discourse with which we began. He doesn't say 87 years ago. He doesn't say nearly a century ago. He uses the language that resonates from the Bible, 77 years ago. And what does he say in this speech? He says, it's kind of a sin to paraphrase Lincoln's extraordinarily beautiful language. But he says that what was the meaning of this battle? What is the meaning of this war? The meaning is that we are struggling to preserve this experiment in democracy. We are struggling to prove the skeptics wrong, the ones who said we couldn't do it on this continent, and we to prove that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. We want to prove that democracy can actually work and survive. And with the phrase that precedes that, we're going to prove it through a new birth of freedom, a rebirth of the freedom that Thomas Jefferson expressed in the Declaration of Independence, by which I think Lincoln meant bringing slavery to an end and ridding the democracy of that terrible taint, which we can talk about a little bit further in a moment. So again, the point really, the Gettysburg Address, the continuity of this address with the earlier texts that we were looking at is really quite striking, if you want to think about the continuities in American political history. The second inaugural address, delivered not quite 2 years later, near the end of Lincoln's life, though he didn't know it, though I think he had premonitions somewhat like those of Martin Luther King. When he's looking back over this war, the war is not yet over, but people have a sense that it's coming to an end, and he's trying to make sense of what this war meant. Why did it happen? Why this is still a religious people. If this was God's will, why did he will it? And in this passage, Lincoln, I think, very directly and very overtly answers that question. If God wills that it continue, this mighty scourge of war, until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. So if you want to talk about the continuity of religion in American political life, I mean, people say, oh, Lincoln didn't go to church and Lincoln didn't belong to any particular denomination. That's all true. But his vision and understanding of what that terrible war was a profoundly religious vision. And what he says in that second inaugural address is this country was founded on an original sin. And this war is the price we have to pay as the expiation for that sin. And it's not a Southern sin, it's an American sin. We have to pay this price together in order to experience this new birth of freedom.
And again, if we could go back to that for a minute, again, we have that sense in Lincoln that God is paying particular attention to the United States.
Right.
You know, and also you see that in the Gettysburg Address. So you're right, there's that religious continuity that we are somehow special in the eye of God.
Absolutely. And, you know, and there are those who find it a very troubling and even terrifying theme in our history that we persist in thinking that. But that, you know, that may be, but that doesn't change the fact that there it is. And it's that idea saturates Lincoln's language that he was destined, predestined, fated to have this responsibility of holding this nation together. And as the war evolved, that's a subject for another seminar, but as the war evolved, it became not only a war to preserve the Union, but also a war to destroy slavery.
We have an interesting comment here from Anthony Loveday. Lincoln's words link back to the city on the hill. That is, we must keep this republic united just as much for the sake of humanity as much for ourselves personally. So there's another constant theme in our American culture.
I think that's true, and I see someone has made the comment we shouldn't romanticize and do hagiography with Lincoln. Again, that's a subject for another seminar. Yes, he shared the racist views of 99.9% of his contemporaries up to a point. But I think if you study his life and his works, and there's a very good book by my colleague Eric Foner that was just published called Abraham Lincoln and American Slavery, and Eric chose that title carefully. American slavery is Lincoln's term to make clear that he thought all Americans bore responsibility for slavery. If you study his life and see how he evolved, I think you will come to the conclusion that he saw that slavery was a terrible evil and that eventually we would have to work our way toward a society in which black and white had equal rights. But that's a subject for another seminar. Now, I've got up on the screen the short passage from Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, and we don't have to spend much time on this. It's a book I'm sure many of you have read, maybe used to teach in your English courses. I simply want to make the point that here's the theme again. When he describes Long Island, I don't know if we have any New Yorkers on board for our seminar, but you know, I go out to the Long Island Sound sometime because it's such a pretty body of water, and you can look across on a misty day from Westchester and see the Long Island shore, or vice versa. That's what Fitzgerald is describing here. And what does he do? He takes it back to the old island that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes. Okay, we were talking about English sailors earlier on, so Dutch sailors, because this is New York or New Amsterdam. A fresh green breast of the New World, its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered, and what a brilliant choice of word there, that, you know, pandering to suggest making false promises, luring people into a situation on false pretenses, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face, for the last time in history, with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. talk about the idea of American exceptionalism, right? That America represented, in effect, the last chance for the human race to get it right, the last chance to see the beauty of unspoiled nature, to match that up with the human imagination, and to put together a society that was worthy of the sublime beauty of the natural world itself. And Gatsby, of course, is a story about how that society was not so sublimely beautiful after all. But again, I call your attention to it just to make the point about the continuity of the theme.
Andy, before we go on, could we just have the title for Eric Foner's book again?
The full title is The Fiery Trial, and the subtitle is Abraham Lincoln and American Slavery. The Fiery Trial, Abraham Lincoln and American Slavery. So,
all right, we just want to be sure to put that out for everybody. There we go.
Yeah.
We had a question earlier about the changes in American exceptionalism over time. You had mentioned that in the 19th century and the early part of the 20th, it was tinged with isolationism. Then after World War II, it became more global and more international. Were there any other changes? Do we see any other changes in the nature of it?
Well, that's an excellent question, and it's exactly on target with the slide that we have on the screen right now. Because here is a short passage from a famous essay by Randolph Bourne called Transnational America, and I'm blanking on the exact date, but it's sometime in the 19-teens. And what he's responding to here is the idea that America is exceptional and special essentially because of its racial purity. That America is all about its Anglo-Saxon heritage, and some people trace that back to the tribes of Central Europe that made their way to England in the Middle Ages, or even before that in the Roman period. That America is America because it's white, because it's English speaking, because people are descended from the same English or maybe Scotch, Irish ancestors, and then everybody else who comes here, and there were a lot of other people coming here, right, in the late 19th century, Jews and Italians and Germans and Scandinavians and Asians who were semi-forcibly brought here to help build the railroads, and of course, those involuntary immigrants, African Americans who had been brought here in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, that all those other people were somehow not American. That they were here and they were kind of, part of the deal and they had work to do, but they weren't really part of the American identity. And, I'm stating this in a way that makes it sound like a crackpot point of view, but sad to say, there are still probably quite a few people in our country who hold that point of view. And in the early 20th century, there were a lot of people who held that point of view and who were not the least bit ashamed to say it. So what Bourne is saying here, he says America doesn't use the word exceptional, he uses the word unique. America is a unique sociological fabric, and it bespeaks poverty of imagination. He's talking about the people who think of America as white Anglo-Saxon only, not to be thrilled at the incalculable potentialities of so novel a union of men. Now, even Bourne doesn't say of men and women. That's another topic. When did we get to the point where people began to understand that women were as fully capable of citizenship and membership in this society as men? But again, topic for another seminar. But to seek no other goal than the weary old nationalism, belligerent, exclusive, inbreeding, the poison of which we are witnessing now in Europe. That is the idea that there's a German race, a French race, an English race, an Italian race, and they have the right to a certain territory. And after all, one of the pretexts on which Adolf Hitler started the Second World War, which Bourne hadn't yet experienced, was on the grounds that there were these racial Germans were living under the rule of French government or Slavic governments, and they needed to be liberated, and a greater Germany needed to be created, so that all people of German heritage could live in the same place, and purify the race by keeping everybody else out, and eventually, as you know, exterminating the race that he hated the most, namely the Jews. Bourne is looking at that and saying, look, that's the attitude that is going to consume Europe in a conflagration that we can't even begin to imagine. Still going on today, right? Tribal wars of all kinds all over the world. Problems that we run into in Iraq and the Middle East, where we call certain countries nations, but actually they're really territories which the British drew some lines on the map when they withdrew from their empire from that part of the world, and groups of people who feel they have nothing to do with one another find themselves living within the same borders and start to kill each other. Again, subject for another seminar. But Bourne is saying America has to be different, and this is another form of American exceptionalism, has to be unique, because America must, if we go that way, we'll ever be a follower. We don't want to be a follower. We want to be the leader of nations. And what he means here is we want to lead by showing that a nation can be truly diverse, and that people of all different cultural heritages and racial and ethnic genealogies can come together and bring into the mix their own immensely valuable traditions, their languages, their points of view. They don't have to stick to their own kind when they come to this country. They can intermarry or not intermarry as they choose, and we will have an entirely different kind of nation state here than anybody has ever dreamed of or imagined in the world. So that's another form of American exceptionalism. But it's in direct contradiction to the sort of race-based American exceptionalism that was still strong in Bourne's time.
That, Andy, would take us back to almost all the way back to Bradford. I mean, that's immigration.
Well, that's right, but there's immigration and there's immigration, right? I mean, there's some people who are fine with immigration as long as the immigrants stay in their own neighborhood, don't aspire to upward mobility, don't think that they have the right to go to the same schools with the people who've been here for a while, and so on and so forth. And Bourne is saying, that's not my kind of immigration.
Mm-hmm.
My kind of immigration is a general mixing, not a melting pot, so that everybody has to get melted into one thing, and all the distinctiveness gets boiled out of the pot, but rather more like a salad where everything mixes together, and the one thing adds flavor and zest to the other thing, and you get a variety and diversity that makes the country exceptional. Now I've left forward in this next slide, as I'm watching the clock here, to President Lyndon Johnson, and this comes from an interview he gave to a historian at my own university. Sat down with him and talked with him in the relatively early days of the Vietnam War, and Johnson says very overtly, now, this is Lyndon Johnson, the old New Dealer, right? This is Lyndon Johnson who really sat at the feet of Franklin Roosevelt and saw poor rural areas of the United States, including in his own state of Texas, transformed brought into the modern world by government investment, right? The Tennessee Valley Authority is what he refers to here, that brought electricity to vast parts of the country that had never had it before. So people could listen to the radio, and people could actually belong to the 20th century. Now, here is Johnson 30 years plus after the height of the New Deal. And he says, what is his goal in Vietnam? Why are we in Vietnam? To answer Norman Mailer's question, I want to leave the footprints of America there. I want them to say, this is what the Americans left. Not this death and destruction and deforestation by napalm and so on, but schools and hospitals and dams. And then shortly after, in the interview, he said, we can turn the Mekong Valley into a Tennessee Valley. So I put that up there. I mean, I actually make a confession here. I always had a sneaking sympathy for Lyndon Johnson. I thought that on matters of race and on his conviction that we really had to fight a serious war against poverty, I thought he was a person of some vision and generosity. And I think that the entanglement in Vietnam was a terrible tragedy. But whatever you may think or not of Lyndon Johnson, here you see the vision that he's bringing to this policy, and it is that it's that vision that Melville expresses in that passage we were looking at earlier. We are the ark of the liberties of the world. We're going to show them the way. And I haven't been to Vietnam, but a lot of people I know who have been there say that it's now a bustling commercial hive of activity, and so in some weird way, 50 or 60 or 70 years after the Vietnam War, it may be that Lyndon Johnson's vision will eventually be realized, but I don't know that the war was a necessary step in that direction.
Andy, on the Johnson quote, this brings up a point that was raised in the chat some time ago. Do you think that American exceptionalism is somehow different from other senses of national glory, in that it is tinged very much with altruism and idealism?
Well, I do, and I'm gonna say something that may shock many of you. I'll put my cards on the table. I don't believe I've ever voted Republican, and I have a lot of problems with our former president George W. Bush, and I do not think that the interventions in the Middle East were a good idea. But I think he was sincere. I think he actually did have an idealistic notion that by shaking up that part of the world, people would be liberated to realize their own democratic aspirations. This has nothing to do with the question of whether these wars were justified or why he shifted his focus from Osama bin Laden to Saddam Hussein, and I'm not trying to get into that discussion, but it's a way of answering your question, Richard. I think there is an element of idealism. Critics would say it's highly naive idealism, in which we go storming into the parts of the world that we really don't know anything about, and think that just by making the investments, bringing in the military, we can clean it all up and make it happen. And I think President Obama is wrestling with the question right now of how that pertains to Afghanistan. In any event, moving on to President Reagan, and again, I don't mean to step on anybody's toes. Maybe we do have a lot of people in the group who admire and revere President Reagan, and I don't mean to be disrespectful of anybody who had such views. But I just want to point out, here we are now. This is about what, when did Reagan leave office? 1980? Is that right, Richard?
Let's see.
Sounds something like that.
Yeah.
88. Okay. So here he is toward the end of his presidency. Thank you, Ruth, for straightening us out on that. He says, I'm looking out the window upstairs from the White House, and I've thought a bit of the shining city upon a hill. Bingo. All of a sudden, we're back to the city on a hill. Only I have to say, I've never understood why Ronald Reagan or his speechwriters felt the need to add that adjective shining. It's not there in the scripture phrase. Now, another point that's just to be made here, I don't mean to be snide about it, but the phrase comes from John Winthrop, he says, as we saw at the beginning of our seminar, who wrote it to describe the America he imagined. Well, in fact, of course, the phrase doesn't come from John Winthrop. The phrase comes from where? It comes from the Gospel of St. Matthew, right? It comes from the Sermon on the Mount. And I've always thought it was a bit ironic that Ronald Reagan, who really was benefiting from that moment when the Republican Party began to capitalize on what we call now the Christian right, seems not to have realized or remembered that he's actually quoting a scripture phrase here. And in fact, he's dressing it up a little bit with that adjective, shining. But be that as it may, he invokes the same image of people of all kinds living in harmony and peace, freedom, and doors open to anyone with the will and heart to get here. There's the immigrant theme, the Statue of Liberty theme, right? Bring me your poor, your tired, your huddled masses yearning to be free. And Reagan connects all of that with the same image that we started with in Winthrop's text. So we've only got a very few minutes left, and now I'm facing this slide that I have no really decisive answer to, and would really be more interested in hearing from members of the seminar than hearing myself continuing to talk. Have we heard the rhetoric of American exceptionalism in the speeches of President Obama? Or, if I might translate the question slightly, is American exceptionalism still alive at our present moment? Are we still invoking it? Or have we lost confidence in it with this terrible economic, they call it a recession, but to a lot of people it feels more like a depression that we have all been going through over the last few years. So I'm really happier to leave that as a question than to give some assertive answer to it. Does somebody want to comment on that or offer up some points of view?
We've gotten a lot of comments here, and people seem to think that that rhetoric is still prevalent in American political dialogue. People can't think of anything offhand that they could point to, but one person points out that it's been a standard part of American politics for a long time. Mike Troy notes that he struggles mightily with this belief. His Cairo speech goes against it, but then his actions in Libya exemplify it. Well, perhaps. Let's see, more internal aspirations, not so much global aspirations. I think President Obama brings in the construct of Barry Lopez the perspective of propose rather than impose. It does not mean that he does not have faith in our strength, but he is willing to engage with other perspectives. So we're getting a lot of comments here. They're going by really fast. I don't see exceptionalism. I see apologies for Americans.
Well, I see a statement. I see a statement that just came up from Brian that President Obama's very identity is a statement about American exceptionalism. And I have to say, I think that's a very important point. You know, we are so tangled up now in our political disputes, and there are a lot of people disappointed with President Obama. There are a lot of people who never liked him, who think they've been vindicated. A lot of people sticking with him. But let's not lose sight of the fact that the whole world was amazed that the United States of America elected a black man president of the United States. And whatever you may think about him personally, the idea that, you know, we got that quickly, and in the aspect of history, you know, slavery came to an end in 1863. So less than 150 years later, less than 50 years after Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. It was just a dream, right? I won't get there with you, but I've been to the mountaintop and I've seen the promised land. The idea that a black man could be elected president of the United States would have struck probably most political prognosticators as recently as 10 years ago as totally preposterous. So I would suggest that that fact alone is evidence that some version of American exceptionalism is still alive. Now, the political arguments that we're having now with ourselves, and I hope for all our sakes that they will become civil and dignified and substantive arguments rather than all the name calling and mudslinging that we've been experiencing, are kind of an argument, I think, over the meaning of American exceptionalism. And I think early on, the first slide, Richard, one of the questions, one of the points was American exceptionalism. The meaning of American exceptionalism has always been contested. So to some Americans, our exceptionalism means we have had and want to have the lowest taxes, the least government regulation, the most opportunity for individual entrepreneurs, a society where we take care of the less fortunate through private philanthropy, which is highly unusual, almost unknown in many other countries in the world. That's one version of American exceptionalism, which is more or less associated with the more conservative side of our politics. Another side says, no, go back to that Winthrop vision that we all need to take care of each other, and what we need is a government that institutes, legislates, enforces a certain kind of fairness that takes some of the wealth away from the wealthy and transfers it in one form or another to the less wealthy, that insists that we provide for the less fortunate, and we do it through what they call sometimes transfer payments or a progressive taxation system. And again, I'm not getting into the argument of whether are the Democrats right or the Republicans right, and there's a lot of gradations in these positions, obviously. But I'm suggesting that in a certain way, the political arguments that we're having now, that super committee in Congress is having with itself right now over how to balance the federal budget, is really an argument about what does it mean to be American? What's special about America? Which direction should we go in? And that argument is unsettled now, as it always has been, and as it probably always will be. It's my view, and that's why I like to participate in these kind of seminars and why I'm fortunate to be in the profession that I'm in. It's my view that having some understanding of the past is helpful for gaining an understanding of what's going on in the present and maybe even thinking about the future. So that's pretty much my my say tonight. I started out by saying I wasn't going to give a lecture, but I guess I talked for an hour and a half, for which I think I should probably apologize. But I'm not good enough yet with this electronic stuff to feel like we can have a general conversation. Richard, maybe the next time we do this, we can do a little bit more of that.
I think we can. There's one final question here. Does the notion of exceptionalism keep us from doing things other governments do that work? Notions of American politics? Yeah, I suppose.
Well, let me give you this. This may seem like a silly example to end with, but here I am in New York City, and we've got something here. Every state has a version of it called Easy Pass, right? That thing that you put in your car, and then you can drive through the toll booth without having to stop and pay any money, because they just take a reading and you get a bill at the end of the month, or it goes straight to your credit card. And it always fascinates me how many people are lined up to pay the tolls and who don't have Easy Pass. And my opinion is, I don't have any data for this, but my opinion is there are a lot of people in America who don't want government to know anything about their private business, including where they're driving their car, what time of day. They don't want that information out there. So they would rather wait in line, and they actually have to pay a little more, than to have this thing in the car which makes them feel like Big Brother is watching me, right? And I think that is an element of American exceptionalism. Americans, ever since the beginning and ever since the revolution, have been highly suspicious of centralized government. And that's one of the challenges that the good folks in Washington who are trying to make something happen are up against. People don't trust government. I think they would trust it more if it worked better. But that's an element, I think, that still persists. And it may seem a silly example, but if somebody has a better explanation for me about why so many people are waiting in line at the toll booth, I'd like to hear it.
Okay, we're going to have to wait. That'll be a topic of another seminar. I think maybe we should give the final word to Samuel Bliss, who wrote, I believe we all need and try to strive for exceptionalism, but the ideas of how to achieve exceptionalism are muddled with opposing views. And that brings us right back to the understanding we started with. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope we have addressed all of your questions here tonight. I urge you to use the forum to continue the discussion. We'll monitor it until November 11th, and we'll pass your comments and questions on to Professor Delbanco. Please remember to submit your evaluations. They're very important to us. And did I mention that we have a poster for you? And if you send in, and we'll mail it to you, and it's free. Did I say it was free?
Anyway, want that octopus. I want that
You'll
octopus.
get the octopus. We love to send you a poster, so please do. Tell your colleagues about it. And by the way, did I tell you it was free? Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all for your excellent participation this evening. We had a lot of chat. I couldn't keep up with it. Andy, I want to thank you for giving us an excellent seminar. You did indeed lecture, but you had really good things to say, and I think you challenged and provoked everyone who was with us tonight. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your participation. Andy, thank you.
Thanks very much.
And I hope you'll all join us again. Watch our online seminar website, because we'll soon be posting our spring schedule. We have a lot of really good topics there for you, and I hope you'll join us again. Again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and good evening.